Wort an David Robinson und Geraldine Chaplin. Welcome.
I wonder how much you remember about your first film appearance.
My first film appearance was in Limelight. I remember the line. I said, "Mrs. Alsop's out." And then I was the only one that had a line. But my sister Josephine, who was quite smart, repeated after me, "Mrs. Alsop's out." And so we had a second take. And I said, "Mrs. Alsop's out." And Josephine said, "Mrs. Alsop's out." And she did it a third time, and then he left it in the film. So poor Michael got paid less than we did. I think we got $40, and he got 10. That's what I remember. I also remember that it was lovely because we missed school.
And of course, after a whole working life in the studio in America, in 1952, he left. Had to, well, didn't have to, but he really chose to leave America. Do you remember much about life in America?
I remember, yes. I remember the house. I remember my father, my mother. I remember going to school, to a couple of different schools, because my father had friends who had a progressive school, so we went to a school where we were allowed to spit at the teacher. And we were allowed to sit on the ground, and then I came home from the first day of school, and I said, "Daddy, I've learned 2 words." And he said, "What are they?" And I said, "Stinky and shut up." And so he took me out of that school. And I remember that, and then another school, one school, a stricter school. And I remember traveling in the train across to New York, staying in New York, and then I remember leaving on the boat, being on the boat. And then America just grew dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. We always thought we were going back, the children. We didn't realize this horrendous thing that had happened, where my father wasn't allowed to return. We had no idea, and we'd just gone a very sort of prolonged holiday. And then eventually we were in school, and eventually I think I found out that my father had been kicked out of America when I was about 15, and someone in school said, your father was kicked out because he's a communist. And by that time I was flirting with Marxism myself, and so I thought, oh, that's cool. And so I went home and I thought, oh, that's Daddy. And maybe it's true, he's a communist, how cool. And I went home to this beautiful house that my father had, full of servants and luxury, and the house, extraordinary. And I thought, well, maybe he's not a communist. So what else?
So I mean, there must have been a moment when you children, and you the eldest of them, you children must have realised, wait a minute, our toys are back there, and we're not going to see them again. Yeah.
No, we did. We just kept counting the days with Michael. We said, not the days, but we said, we've still been more time in America than we have in Europe. That was our big thing. We're going back.
Yes.
And I was very worried about going back on the Queen Elizabeth. We'd come over on a boat called the Queen Elizabeth, and I'd befriended the man who ran the gym, and he gave me his favourite little china piggy, and I broke it in the Savoy bathtub. And so I was rather glad that we weren't going back, because I thought I might run into him again and to have to explain the broken toy.
Did you have any sense of what it was meaning to your parents? I mean, this.
No. Only much later on. I mean, as I say, we didn't even know that we weren't going back, and it must have been devastating. For my mother, I think it must have been really devastating, and for it must have been devastating. I mean, what a absurd, stupid thing to do.
We know now that really they had acted. They were very nervous because they'd acted outside their rights. They couldn't do it. If he'd gone back, they'd have been extremely embarrassed. They wouldn't have known what to do. But you know, he could have gone back, he could have challenged them, and they'd have been in a mess. But I have a feeling he wouldn't want to go back to that atmosphere.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Also, the fact that we stayed in a hotel for a long time, and then my mother was pregnant again, and she put her foot down and she said, I am not going to have this baby in a hotel, so buy a house. So he bought a house, and then I think that once we were installed in the house, he felt very comfortable in Switzerland, even though they were spying on him.
Oh, yes.
They were spying on him, and his phone was tapped. I mean, the things had come out with that you discovered later on, that even the Swiss were spying on him. And he was going to be knighted, and he was going to get, I don't know what, in 1956, I think, and the Americans said, absolutely not, no way. They were very afraid of him, and I can see why. He had the mortal weapon, the weapon of mortal laughter, to use your words. The weapon of mortal laughter.
Not my words, I'm afraid. I wish they were, but it's a great phrase.
Yeah. It's an extraordinary weapon.
Because he turned the most, you know, last night we saw the gold rush. I mean, the gold rush was based on the Donner Party disaster. These poor people were lost in the Sierra.
Yes, and the cannibalism, it was a terrible, he was I read in this interview that he did later on in the 70s, when he was in his 70s, that he had terrible trouble with the gold rush, finding a motivation for the story. He said, okay, I want to do something about the North, but everything had been done, and so the little tramp, so when he goes up there, it's a comedy, so he finds gold, so what? And so he finds gold. He said, I was thinking in terms of snow and of taking off their socks and their socks standing up straight because of the freezing socks. He said, but I was in agony to find a motivation for the story, and one thing led to another. And then he said, and finally it came to one very simple thing, hunger. And seeing the film last night, that film could have been called Hunger. Everything is motivated by hunger.
Comedy and tragedy are
Yes.
very close. As children, I mean, did you realise who he was? I mean, what he was?
Yes, we knew that we had the greatest father in the world. In fact, one of the most awful experiences in my whole lifetime was in California. My brother and I escaped, and we went down the driveway past the gate, and there was a lady passing by there, and we said, we're Charlie Chaplin's children, we're Charlie Chaplin's children, we're Charlie Chaplin's children. And she must have thought, oh, these horrible brats. And so she said, and who's that? And we rushed upstairs and we hid under the bed. And we thought, maybe it's all a lie. Maybe he isn't the greatest man in the world. Maybe we've been told lies. It was horrifying. I'm still marked by it.
However, she was obviously a rather smart lady who knew how to put children together.
Exactly, yes. Oh, she must be brats. Yeah.
And I mean, all your childhood, he was still working, wasn't he? I mean, he was working very hard.
He was working, yes, he was working. I was born, but I don't remember it, but he was working on Monsieur Verdun, and then Limelight. Then we came to Europe, and then he worked on King in New York, which was also a response to his having been booted out. And then he worked on his autobiography, or maybe not necessarily in that order, I think. And then he worked on The Countess from Hong Kong, and then he worked on The Freak, which he never made, a beautiful script, as you know. But he worked all his life, and then they wouldn't insure him for The Freak. And so he started composing music to all his silent films. And I think the last silent film that he wrote the music for was Sunnyside. Then he didn't have any work, so he died.
I'm going to quarrel with you about that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think the last one he did was Woman of Paris, wasn't it?
Maybe. Yes, because he wrote the music for The Freak, and the music of The Woman of Paris was the music from The Freak that he used. That's right.
Yes, because it was one of the great privileges of my life that I was with them in the studio when he was supervising the music, and it was the very last day of that last in the studio. Oh, thrilling moment.
Did he conduct?
No, he was very frail.
He was on his way out.
Yes, he communicated. Do you remember? I mean, the mind was obviously working all the time, but it didn't. He would communicate intermittently, just say something. I mean, I remember he sat there very quiet all the time, and I tried to talk, and I said, "Did it take you long to write this music?" And suddenly, bright as a berry, just like in his youth, said, "Not long, inspiration mostly." And then you start again.
That's right, it was a Woman of Paris.
So, I mean, what was his working day like? When he was working on the films, when he was working on the scripts, when he was working on the autobiography, how did he go about it?
Well, as far as I remember, he would, in Switzerland this is, he would get up at 4 and try to teach himself French. He had the Berlitz method, and the one thing that my father could never do, and he could not do, was learn French. He could speak French like he speaks German in The Great Dictator, and everyone would think it was French, and French people would say, yes, but he's speaking French, but he had the perfect sound, but he didn't have the words, and he tried to, and he got to Je prends le premier train pour Paris. Ouvrez la porte. Fermez la fenêtre. And he never got past that. And it made him furious. And he would wake up at 4 o'clock and try and learn French, and try desperately. And then he'd get down to his real work, to his day job, where he'd go downstairs, have breakfast, and sit in the study in front of a blank piece of paper. And he would stay there all day. He wouldn't come out for lunch. They would bring him a yogurt for lunch. And it's a typical Swiss dish, and he would bring the dish and look at the fish and say, Emma, you here, and he'd kiss the fish with his lips, and he'd go, oh. And then he'd suck out the eye, my darling Emma, and we'd go, oh, Daddy, stop it. And then he'd ask for the wine, and he'd look at the wine, and he'd smell it, and then he'd taste it. And then he'd say to the waiter, beautiful. And of course, by then the whole restaurant would be watching, and then he'd go into a lot of other tricks. He had fantastic tricks with a napkin and a fork. And, he'd sometimes do the dance of the rolls, which was always a great pleasure. In fact, at the one restaurant